What is it that separates a good show from a great show? Well, a lot of that is due to the narrative that is crafted by the podcast host and the creator and the production team. And a lot of that is to do with how they edit and plan the edits for that show. And that is what I'm going to dig into today here on the Podcast Accelerator, the thrice-weekly show that brings you podcast education, industry insights, and straight-talking reactions to podcasting news. I'm your host, Mark Asquith. Welcome to the show. I am that British podcast guy and CEO and co-founder here at Rebel Base Media, the podcast tech company that creates the Podcast Success Academy, podcast websites, productivity, Rebel Base Studios, and the finest podcast host on the planet, Captivate.fm, the world's only growth-oriented podcast host, where you can host and start multiple shows for one simple price. Go and find out what all the fuss is about and go and try Captivate for 7 days at Captivate.fm. Now, today on the show, like I said, I'm going to talk about narrative. But in particular, I'm going to talk about crafting a narrative using editing techniques and using editing in a way that maybe you haven't thought of before. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. But a lot of independent podcasters, especially certain types of independent podcasters, haven't thought about it like this before. So I'm going to talk about that in about 30 seconds. But before that, let me just give a big shout out to the team at AWeber who have helped us just to launch Captivate.fm to the public and just migrate hundreds and hundreds of podcasters in from other podcast hosts. We couldn't have done that without the help of AWeber because we communicate with everyone. I communicate with all my podcast listeners via AWeber, and you need to be doing the same, all right? So if you aren't using email marketing to connect with your audience, please go ahead and do so, all right? You can go and sign up for a 90-day free trial. They'll look after you throughout that trial over at markasquith.com/AWeber. Okay, look, honestly, I don't edit this show too much, but as a short-form podcast, that's kind of okay. Like, I can kind of get away with that. I know that Evo's the same, James Cridland's the same when it comes to pod news, but editing your show as a longer-form podcaster has more benefits than just cutting out the ums and the ahs. You should really be editing way more. Now, let me give you my kind of 2 cents on this one. Like I've said over the last few weeks and months, podcasting is changing. It really, really is. And we're seeing so much talent in the space now. We're seeing production companies. We're seeing recap podcasts. We're seeing so many different shows spring up that are taking this seriously. Now, my concern with many independent podcasters is that a lot of independent podcasters started being like kind of business shows or marketing shows or like entrepreneurial shows. And what they did was they thought to themselves, you know what? We're going to have a kind of a cookie cutter format, which is all right. It's not. I don't think it's the best way to do it, but I get it. But what a lot of people are doing is they're just saying they're kind of thinking that by not editing, they're being more authentic. Yeah, I don't edit my show. I leave everything in because it's raw and it's authentic. Kinda, that's all right. But if you want to really start to monetize the show, and I mean actually monetize the show, like not sell your own products, not do affiliate stuff. I'm talking if you want sponsors, okay? You need to craft a quality narrative. It's something that we talked about with Jordan a couple of weeks ago on the Podcast Movement recap when we recorded out in the field at Podcast Movement. And what you've got to understand is that editing is much more about actually turning content into a story. It's about crafting the right story. It's about knowing how to tell a story as opposed to simply editing the ums and ahs out, doing a bit of EQ and some compression, okay? Now, the best editors do this. They know this, okay? And it's not, when you're looking at these people, it's not about finding an editor. It's about finding a producer, okay? Now, to hire a producer for your show doesn't really cost that much more than it does to hire an editor. It's just about finding the right one. And there's a few wonderful people out there doing it. John Bakinas is one of them. You've got Joel Sharpton and a few others out there doing this wonderfully. But the difference it can make to your show is astronomical, all right? If you listen to any show from Wondery or from anyone from like Westwood One or Podcast One, they're not just recording and letting it out. No, they're actually taking the story and they're taking out the bits that are superfluous. They're taking out the bits that don't matter. And they're actually putting the focus on telling the tale. Because ultimately that's what we're trying to achieve here, is telling a story with our podcast. And if we're not doing that, then it's not ever going to serve you very well. You're never going to be able to actually monetize something versus another show. You know, if it comes down to the wire, all else is equal. The download numbers are equal. Your branding's equal. Your quality of engagement is equal. The better quality audio wins. It does, ultimately. You know, you've got to be really tight on that. Now, I know it sounds like a lot of work, but what I'm talking about here is be more thoughtful, all right? Be more thoughtful. And there's a friend of mine does this really, really well, Cam Capriotto. Cam is, 450 episodes in nearly to his podcast, Remarkable Results Radio, which is an automotive aftermarket podcast, and he's busy building out his own network. And Cam from day one has said that he wants to be the NPR of the automotive aftermarket, and he succeeds wildly in that space because of this. Yeah, sure. He could kind of say, well, you know, authenticity, I'm going to leave everything in. But he doesn't. He interviews his guests and he crafts a story and a narrative that puts them at the front of it, that creates the right story. It's part of his brand. Steve Lazarus, yourlondonlegacy.com, does the exact same thing. So there's no bragging rights to saying, I don't edit anything, I leave it in, it's so authentic. That's not authentic, all right? Authentic is telling the true story, is leaving the stuff in that's maybe difficult to hear. It's not editing, all right? Because if you want to be taken seriously as a podcast, you have to be putting high quality content out. And like I said, on a short form show, I know it's a little different. Evo and I, we don't edit quite as much as we maybe could do. I could edit this down, I'm sure. And I know I've seen James Cridland. I've been in a coffee shop actually watching him record pod news onto his phone. You know, that is straight out the door, but it's news. So you kind of got to get up to date with your format. You've got to understand when the format needs it. But believe me, if you're putting episodes out that are longer than 20, 25 minutes, and they are narratively crafted, so interview stories, dramas, solo shows around educational content, please be editing, all right? And it doesn't cost much. You just need to look for someone that's got more of a story angle to them and a skill set that matches that than just a simple editor, all right? Trust me, you will attract a higher quality audience by doing that, okay? So just think on that. That's the thought for the day. That's my 2 cents on it. And as always, listen, thank you so much for joining me here on the Podcast Accelerator. Remember to tell your podcasting friends that the show is available to listen to for free in any app that supports podcasts. And I urge you to go and see what all of the fuss is about. How can a podcast host make such waves? Well, honestly, Captivate.fm has been built from the ground up to serve independent podcasters. Honestly, the feedback that we're receiving on Captivate.fm is insane. I want you to please go and try it as your podcast host. You can do it for 7 days completely for free. Go and do that now at Captivate.fm. And until the next time, thank you so much, and never forget, the more you expect from yourself, the more you will excel.